Okay, so picking up where we left off with the last tutorial, rather than create a whole new project and file for learning about text layers, because it's a pretty simple and short thing to learn. And so to create a text layer is pretty simple. You just go over to the text tool, and if you click on that, you'll see that you have the horizontal type tool, vertical type mask tool, and horizontal type mask tool. And we'll talk about the differences between those in just a little bit. So to start with, we're just going to use the horizontal type tools. If I select that, up at the top under all of my tool options, I've got the font, which I'm going to leave it as Balloon Drop Shadow D. I don't know if you'll have that on your machines, but you can select any font that that your heart desires. Next to it is whether it should be bold, italic, regular. In my case, Balloon Drop Shadow only has regular, but if I was to search for like, say Helvetica, which is a, common font, Helvetica actually has several options. It's got light oblique, which is sort of like italics, regular, oblique, and then bold and bold oblique. And you'll see that there's actually a sample of what that font looks like to the side of it. So if I go back to the, if I come back over here and do my my Balloon Drop Shadow regular, I only have this one option, but you do see the sample next to it. And then next to that is the font size, and this is in points. It doesn't really matter, what size it is. By default, it may start at 12 points, which is really tiny. And you'll notice it only goes up to 72 in the menu, but you can select this and you can type in whatever you want. So I had like 160, which is actually a pretty good size for this page. This you don't generally need to modify, but there's smooth, strong, crisp, sharp. That's something we can zoom in once we've created some text and see what the difference is. There's also some basic paragraph things like where do you want the text aligned, to the right, to the center, or to the left, center, or right. There is also you can pick the color here. So notice you have the eyedropper. So I could say, oh, I really want this to be right. Oh, I'm not on the right layer to do that. I'd have to go to the Steve Buscemi layer to select that, but I'm currently here, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. But so I can pick color. We'll talk about text on the path probably, or create warp text a little bit later. And then if I click on this, it actually gives me this panel that gives me a whole bunch of settings for text, which is more some of these things are more important for other uses, but we'll look at a couple of them today. And then there's the paragraph, which gives me a few more options for how the text should be, whether it's hyphenated, if I want stuff input, if I want stuff indented or not. And for what we're doing, we're not going to really deal with the paragraph settings, but we will be dealing with some of the character settings. Okay, so I've got my text selected, my text tool selected, and right now it looks like I have a brush. And I think this is just a bug in this version where for some reason it hasn't updated to the new tool until I click, at which point it will automatically create this lorem ipsum text, which is it's Latin, and it's like the standard if you're doing graphic design work and you're trying to create text fields. There's this standard Latin statement that gets used everywhere, and these are the first two words of that statement. And it just like automatically gives you something so you can see what the font size is and all of that. So once I've got this selected, you'll notice that when I clicked on it, it created it right here over at the edge. If I change where the text alignment is, you'll notice that the position of the text changes as well. I'm going to leave it centered, although by default I believe it's probably to the right, or sorry, aligned left. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it center alignment for now. And then I'm going to use the move tool. I'm going to select the move tool. I'm going to come down here. And even though I have this no symbol, if I click, I can click and drag to move this layer around. Now, the font I'm using actually has a transparent fill for all the letters, but typically this would be filled in. One of the nice things in Photoshop is now whenever I go through these different fonts, it actually gives me a example of what this text will look like with these different fonts. And you'll notice some of them don't work at all, and that's just totally fine. I'm going to choose something other than this one, although I love this font. For, you know, apparently I was doing something ridiculous previously. So I'm just going to go, you can really choose anything you want. I'm just going to try and find something that fits on the page at this size and is solid. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Century Schoolbook. So I've selected that. And again, I don't know why the no symbol is showing up, even though clearly I can move this around. You'll notice that it has created its own layer, and text layers are what are called vector layers. And if you remember from a previous tutorial, I kind of talked about the difference between raster and vector. Vectors are instructions for how something should be drawn rather than the actual filled in pixels. That means that if we were to scale, like blow this whole image up, Steve and Miley's images would get pixelated, but this font would probably still be crisp. Now I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a touch. And you will see that even though this is a vector file, it is displaying it as though it is a as though it's a raster, right? It's got pixelated edges. And that's just the way Photoshop works. If I select my text tool again, and I double click in this space, you'll notice that I can select the text and it turns green, which means it's basically the opposite color that, you know, of whatever it was. And if I change this smooth to strong, you'll notice that these edges change a little bit, or if I change it to crisp, it changes things a touch as well. And if I change it to sharp, it again makes minor modifications. And all of this is really doing is basically saying, how should the font blend with the background, right? Smooth is the default because it basically makes the edges and corners look the smoothest when you're at an appropriate, you know, level of zoom. Whereas if I go to crisp, right, that's going to sharpen those edges up just a little bit. If I go to sharp, it's going to make it even sharper. And so it really just depends on, and if I say none, then it's going to be really pixelated. All right, so it really depends on how you want this to look. And Mac LCD and Mac are just two other slight modifications. All right, I'm going to leave it at smooth because that's the default setting. And we've already talked about font size and everything else up here. You can click on 3D and make 3D text if you want. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. So the other thing is, so with the text tool, if I double click or even click once on top of existing text, it's going to let me modify that text. If I click somewhere off in space, it's going to create a new text layer. And if I try to undo that, it's not going to undo it. So what that means is I just have to come over here, click on this layer, and drag it down and throw it in the trash. Okay. So, so I've got this text. You'll notice that as I'm moving this around, there's these pink lines that pop up. Those are guides that tell me that this is now centered in the middle of the image. That's a text layer. It's pretty simple. You know, I can, if I double click, I can get in there. Now, some of the tools that are not accessible, I can move this. There we go. And now that I've clicked on this, there was that no symbol, but for some reason, and maybe I just need to update Photoshop again here soon. But after clicking on it a couple times, I was able to access these handles, right? So I can adjust this. Now note, when I scale the text, it actually changes the font size over here, right? So it's not changing it to a percentage, it's just changing the size of the font. Some of the other settings here that are useful, one in particular is this VA. And I'm probably going to have to set that transform. So the VA, what that does is it sets how much space are between each of these characters. And so there's times when you want to align all your text so some of it's squished together or spread further apart. And this is what allows you to do that. So it allows you to say, oh, well, if I go to 200, right, these characters are really, distant from one another. And if I go to -100, they're basically all touching, right? They're smashed completely together. And so sometimes you'll see things where someone has, maybe it's 3 lines of text and each word's a different length. So let's go ahead and we'll do an example of that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new text object. And in the process of that, let's go ahead and we'll hit enter, and I'm going to call this, I'm just going to make this line several more characters in length. So I've created these 2 lines, and everything is really hard to see right now, so I am going to hide this other text layer, and that actually just cleans it up immensely. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in front of their faces, and I'm going to get to work on this. So let's say on one of these layers, I want all the characters to be close together, but I want this to fill in across the entire width of this. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, and I'm just going to highlight the top word. And then I'm going to change this VA. I'm just going to go all the way up to 200. And it looks like that's not even quite enough. So now I can select it, and I should be able to say, like, let's say 300. And that didn't even do it, so let's say 400. And I could still go more, so I'm going to say 500. That's getting a lot closer. I think there might be, oops, nope. So maybe I need like 550. Oops, I have to, so you'll notice that didn't do anything, and that's because I did not have this selected. So it was just doing it to that space between 2, like right at the end, which isn't really helpful. So let's say 550. And I'm just hitting tab to tab out of this. You can also just sort of click off in space. So it looks like 550 might be the winner there. Yeah, and if I delete that space that was in front of the letter A, then now I've got something where, right, I've been able to align these so they're somewhat aligned and look absolutely terrible. But you get the idea that you can have your letters spread more fully or more closely together by using this VA option. If you are looking for settings that for some reason are not showing up, you can always click the 3 ellipses at the bottom there, and it'll pop open additional settings. Right, so one of the other things you can do, rather than just scaling the text uniformly using the font size, you can also either make it fatter or make it narrower, or sorry, taller, using these 2 settings. So if I select this top line of text and I want to make it all fatter, I can either numerically adjust the percentage, or if I hover over the icon, I can actually just click and drag left or right to either stretch or shrink the width of the characters. So you can kind of see how that happens, right? So maybe I can say, oh, I got pretty close to being about where I wanted to be in terms of alignment. And then maybe I just adjust this a little bit. And the same thing goes for this, the height, right? I can make these characters, I can stretch these so that they're much more tall than they are wide. And so I'm going to go ahead and try and deselect that. Right, so now I've got some really ugly text in front of this. Okay, so those are some of the basics of using the text layer. Now, the next option is to use a text mask as well. So I'm going to turn this text off. I'm going to select layer 1, and I'm actually just going to hide everything else. So whoop, I'm just going to hide everything else, so it's just Miley Cyrus. I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to my type tool, and I'm going to go to the, and you can use the vertical type tool. It basically just has the text go down. Okay, so I'm going to use the horizontal type mask tool. So I'm going to select this. Now, there's a couple differences in what happens here. First, it makes a mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and click. And when I do that, your text may be spread all over the place because these character settings are still probably set to 189% or whatever it was, 103%, and this VA would have probably still been set to 550 or whatever I had it set to. So what you'll need to do is select this, set it to 0, and just set these back to 100%. You might also just be able to go, yes, in this little menu here and go down to reset character. Now, if for some reason you can't find this character menu, it's this letter A here in this bar of tools, but you can also go up to window and you can go down to character, and if it's not checkmarked, it will open it up in the same place and the same way this is usually. And right now it says color ? And that's because this is a mask. It has no color right now. So again, if I want to, I can change all the other settings up here. But notice there's this check mark to say that I'm done. And that's also a hint that if I choose any of these other tools, it's going to automatically finish this operation. And so even if I go, let's say I want to move this, I click on this, I'm like, okay, well, I've got, this is turned into a selection area. So I'm going to go ahead and move this. So if I click and drag this, you'll notice that it actually picks up the selected part of the image and moves it, right? And it's not creating a new layer. It's actually just moving this over here and overwriting it. We don't want to, that's not what we want to do. Let's say we want to move the selection area to align it in some way. So I'm going to undo that. In order to move a selection area, rather than move what we've selected, you need to use one of the selection tools. It doesn't really matter which one, but definitely I know that the elliptical marquee or the rectangular marquee tool and the lasso tool should work. So now that I've done that, now if I click within this, I can actually move this around without moving the image that it's, the layer that it's on simultaneously. And I just want you to note the selection area isn't linked to any layer. I currently have this layer selected, but if I was to turn on Steve Buscemi and come down here and select that layer, then if I go ahead and use the move tool at this point, what it's going to do is it will pull, right, Steve Buscemi's face and move it around, but you can see it's not showing up here, and that's right because the mask is hiding everything else that's there, right? So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Now, the other option that I have is I can use this to either hide or show an image as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and, oops, that looks really terrible. I'm going to use one of the selection tools, and I'm going to move this text that I've created up a bit. Now, something to note with the, as far as I understand, I haven't actually tried to click select and mask and see if I can actually edit this text, but I don't think once you've created this, you can't really edit the settings on the text. You can only, let's see. Yeah, you can't do that. So I'm going to click no there. Right, so once it's set, it's set. So it's best to potentially use the type tool first, and you can always actually turn that into a mask as well, and we'll look at that in a second. So let's say I want to make this, a mask. I want this to, oops. Oh boy. I want this to mask out part of this image or only show part of it. What I can do is with this selected, I can come up to, I can click on one of my selection tools and I can just go to select and mask. And then I can say output to, let's just say layer mask, right? And then I hit OK. And granted, I could feather this and smooth it and do all of those things, but we're not going to do that right now, right? And so now I've got some really creepy things going on. But you can see that, right, it's hiding everything except the mask that I created. So this works all right, but if you're really interested in using it as a way to select something that's behind it, I'm going to go ahead and undo that. I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect all of that. And I'm going to go back to my standard type tool. I'm just going to say horizontal type tool, select, do lorem ipsum or whatever. I'm actually going to, because I can still edit this, as long as I go back and select the type tool, I can select, I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to come in here, I'm going to delete a space. And I'm doing this just so I can have more characters on top of the actual image of her hair and forehead, rather than have it off here in the background. So once I've got everything set here so that the text is more focused on her forehead, there's other ways that I can use this layer to clip or hide or expose the underlying layer. And instead of creating a standard mask, I'm going to create what's called a clipping mask. But before I do that, I have to do something called rasterized text. And so if you think that you might need to modify the text in some way after you do this, it's always good to duplicate this layer. So I'm going to go ahead and say, right-click on it and say duplicate layer. And I'll just call it, sure, lorem ipsum copy. And then I'm just going to hide the lorem ipsum copy. So this is one that I'll still be able to edit. When I rasterize this layer, I won't be able to edit the text anymore, but I will be able to use it as something called a clipping mask. And so if I right-click on this now and I go to rasterize type, then what that does is it turns it basically into an image layer rather than a vector layer. So once I've rasterized it, then I need to make a clipping mask. And you would think that if I wanted this layer to control what part of the lower layer is visible, that I'd want it on top of the lower layer. However, that's not the case with clipping masks. What you want to do is you want to put the layer that you want to be clipped on top of the layer that will do the clipping. I have no idea why it's this order, but it is. So I need to pull this layer 1 up above this lorem ipsum. And then if I right-click on it and I go to create clipping mask, and this is on the layer, the image of Miley Cyrus, then what happens is it will clip her layer to just be showing through where the text is. Right? So this is another way to work with this. To work with text, but again, you have to rasterize it first. So then I can't edit this any longer the way it currently stands. So that's just a note. Now, a way you can get around that is you could use a smart object that is just a text layer, and then you could be able to edit that smart object, but it would appear as a raster image in this Photoshop file. So we could look at how to do that very quickly as well. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. I am going to hide this layer because I have this one that's a copy that's still editable. I'm going to right-click on this. I'm going to go down to Convert to Smart Object. And so now that it's a smart object, I should be able to pull this down, right-click on her, and go to Create Clipping Mask. I get the same result, right? However, what I can do now is if I double-click on this and I use my type tool, I should be able to change this text to something else and save it, and then go back to this image and it should have updated. right? So that's another way that smart objects are really useful, because it's a nice workaround to be able to use text as a clipping mask, but I'll be able to still make use of that. Okay. That's it for this tutorial. Hopefully it wasn't too discombobulated.